Hey guys, we are up to topic 9.2, which means we are in the home stretch here, the final unit of our APUSH curriculum. And today we're going to look at the election of Ronald Reagan and the resurgence of conservatism in the 1980s. Let's get into it. Alright, so causes and effects of the resurgence in conservatism. Let's find out what those things are. So, who's running for re-election in 1980, of course, is one Jimmy Carter, and he was facing all kinds of problems, the energy crisis situation, the Iran hostage crisis. It was not looking good for James Carter, so instead, attention focuses to his opponent. Again, all of these things are floating out there, the Iran hostage crisis, the energy crisis, stagflation, hostility of the government simply gotten too large. The Supreme Court had gotten too liberal. They handed down decisions that were very unpopular with conservatives. But the number one thing you could point to, and this is something politicians do a lot of, is this idea that if you're challenging a sitting president, all you have to do is ask the people, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And obviously, if you're not, then the implication is that the current president needs to go, and you need new, fresh blood in there. And this is something that Ronald Reagan ran on. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And if you look at the numbers, it was kind of hard to say that Americans would have been better off in 1980 than they were in 1976. Now, Ronald Reagan is a bit of a hero to many conservative politicians today. He was a man who believed that the government had gotten too large, and the best thing you can do is to take the government, as the greatest extent possible anyways, out of people's lives, out of people's economic choices, and let people have independence from the government. And that would then allow people to flourish in his ideas. All right, let's look at the election results in 1980, and yeah, it was bad for Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is absolutely steamrolled here, and again, if you're an incumbent president and you get shellacked like this, that's not good. You have clearly ticked off the American people. It was a runaway, right? A runaway. All right, let's get into some Reaganomics now. And let's be honest, guys, economics, not a real exciting topic, so to make it a little more palatable, let's look at some ridiculous pictures of Ronald Reagan. Here's one of him in his sweatpants and dress shirt. That's a nice look, I gotta say. Here is Nancy Reagan, his wife, hanging out with Santa Mr. T. That's about as 1980s as you can get in those pictures. All right, let's do economics, guys. So Ronald Reagan and his advisors were in favor of what they called supply-side economics. This is, again, Reaganomics. And what this involves is doing things like cutting taxes on both corporations and individuals, and deregulation of businesses. And we're going to talk about deregulation here in a moment. The thought was, if you do this, it'll put more money into the pockets of people and businesses, and that would result in greater economic growth. That was his plan. This is also known as trickle-down economics. So if businesses are paying less in taxes, they'll have more money around to invest in more workers. Those workers have a job. They'll spend more money. That means there'll be more tax revenue coming into the government. So the idea is if you lower taxes, you'll actually bring in more tax revenue if this works. Now, trickle-down economics is a controversial idea. If you're a conservative person, you believe in this very strongly. If you're a liberal person, you say, well, no, this doesn't work. All it does is make the rich richer and the poor poorer. In fact, that is the big criticism of Ronald Reagan, is that the economic growth we saw under Reagan was a bit of an illusion, and that the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. That was the charge that people made. If you look at the numbers here, you can see the top 1% do, in fact, do pretty well under Ronald Reagan, and the bottom 90%, they are relatively stagnant from 70 onwards, so well into the Reagan administration. However, I will say this, if you look at inflation, okay, that's the blue bar there, notice how it's going up and up and up and up, and then it peaks in 1980, and then very quickly goes down. Now, there is a little bit of a bump here in 84. There is some economic issues there. But with inflation going down, that means prices go down, which means even if your salary is not going up, if your money buys more, it's like getting a pay raise. So economics improve across America in the 1980s. All right, let's get into deregulation. What is that about? Again, this is a key component of Ronald Reagan's economic policy, Reaganomics we call it. And a great example of this comes in 1981, his very first year on the job. There was a big strike of air traffic controllers across America. They said that their working conditions were too tough, hours too long, they weren't getting enough pay and so forth, so they go on strike. They are ordered to return to work, they refuse, and then Reagan fires 11,359 of these air traffic controllers. And the message was clear: Reagan was not going to allow strikes to damage the economy of the United States. So other examples of deregulation, federal control of airfares was eliminated, allowing airlines to set their own airfares and not have to get them approved by the government first. More federal lands were opened up to energy development, so we're going to see oil drilling and coal digging and so forth on federal lands in a greater amount. And this leads to relaxation of some of those environmental protections that were put in place in the 1970s. The idea that these environmental protections may have gone too far and were actually causing prices to go up because it was more difficult to actually conduct business with some of these regulations. Reagan also decided that one thing we could do to lessen the footprint of the government and how much the government was spending was to cut back on welfare programs. He believed that many welfare programs were wasteful in the sense that they were handing money out with no real incentive for people to work and to get off of welfare, and so he makes it a priority to cut back on welfare spending. All right, now, so Reagan set the stage here with Reaganomics in the 1980s. Remember, he had said in 1980 to the American people, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And the people had said no, and they elected Reagan in a landslide. So let's see if his challenger, Walter Mondale, can do the same thing to Reagan. So Reagan is running on the strong economic recovery that happened under his watch, and also the tougher foreign policy. And Reagan is really going to help reignite the Cold War, or at least put pressure on the Soviet Union because of their activities, say, in Afghanistan. And that was a breath of fresh air for some Americans who believed being tougher on the Soviets strengthened America as well. And then other people, of course, feared that it might result in World War III. So nonetheless, that's what Reagan's running on: strong economics, strong foreign policy. Democrats are going to choose Walter Mondale, the former vice president under Jimmy Carter, and his running mate was Geraldine Ferraro. She was a historic choice, you can see on the right, because she was the first woman chosen as a vice presidential candidate for a major political party. So I said a moment ago, could Mondale do what Reagan had done to Carter? Can he say, are you better off 4 years ago, and would the people respond to that? No, they won't. Okay, you can see Reagan absolutely just destroys Mondale in the Electoral College and the popular vote. Mondale only able to win Minnesota and the District of Columbia. All right, now let's talk a little bit about foreign policy and also some scandals under Reagan. This is going to be the kind of the Watergate scandal of Reagan, although it will not be as extreme as Watergate. It's the big scandal you need to remember for Ronald Reagan. So to set the stage here, there's this arms for hostages plan that's being cooked up behind the scenes in the Oval Office. And what this would involve is a couple of moving pieces here. So the first piece was the United States would sell weapons to Iran. Again, Iran, the very country that had put Americans, had held them hostage for 444 days. We're going to sell them weapons. Now, I'll tell you why in a second. But the important thing is there was an embargo on Iran, so selling weapons to Iran was actually illegal, and yet we are planning on doing that. So that's the first part. Why in the world would we sell weapons to the country that calls us the Great Satan? Well, Iran, in theory, if we sold them weapons, they would use their influence to free American hostages hostages who had been taken in Lebanon. Lebanon is in the Middle East, guys. It was in the middle of a very bloody civil war. Some Americans had been taken hostage. Iran had a lot of influence in Lebanon, so if we sell weapons to Iran, they would then, on that condition, help free Americans living in Lebanon. Now, by the way, you might be wondering, why does Iran need weapons? They're fighting a big war against Iraq. So Iraq had invaded Iran, and so Iran was desperate for weapons. We're willing to sell them so they will then help free Americans. Now, what to do with the money from those arms sales? Well, it was thought, well, hey, since we've got this money, let's then take that money to buy weapons and fund these anti-communist guerrillas in Nicaragua. So Nicaragua, which is in Central America, had a left-leaning government that was, Soviet-friendly. We didn't like that, so we're helping fund a rebellion. Again, they're called the Contras in Nicaragua. And the Contras, and for that matter the government in Nicaragua, committed horrible atrocities. So again, let's summarize. Let's go back. We're going to sell weapons to Iran, our enemy. Iran's going to help free hostages in Lebanon. And then we're going to take the proceeds from those arms sales, which were illegal, to help fund a violent anti-communist rebel group in Nicaragua. Okay, you got all that? I know, it's super confusing. So eventually, these secret dealings come to light, and it becomes a massive scandal because all kinds of rules and norms are being broken in secret. And there were trials and investigations. About a dozen Reagan administration officials were forced to resign. It was, again, a very, very big scandal. But is it such a big scandal that Ronald Reagan himself will be impeached? That was the big question. And it turns out, no. Ronald Reagan basically claimed that he didn't really know what was going on, that this was all happening without his knowledge, that this was something kind of a pet project of some people in his administration that he was not fully aware of, and therefore he wasn't responsible. And he's able to ride that wave, and things eventually calm down, and Ronald Reagan survives. All right, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some social changes in America. So think back to American history. We had a first Great Awakening during the colonial times. We had a second Great Awakening in the early to mid-1800s. And in many ways, you can argue what we're going to look at next is the Third Great Awakening. What it is a growth in the political power of conservative evangelical Christians in America. Now, the 1980s, for me, doesn't seem like it was that long ago because I was born in the 1980s. But let's be honest, that was several decades ago, and America's changed quite a bit. America today is not nearly as religious as we were in the 1980s. In the 80s was this resurgence of religion and in the political power of American Christians. And what we're seeing is the conservative movement embrace some of the religious aspects that were present in America, and they see things in America that they don't much care for. They saw the growth of feminism. They saw the growth of gay rights. They saw the growth of affirmative action. Remember, affirmative action is basically where we are going to set racial policies for admission to schools and job applications and so forth, where we might limit the number of white candidates to allow other non-whites to have a shot. We also saw, of course, the growth of abortion rights in this time period. And so you have all these things kind of all coming together as a perfect storm. And there were a lot of Christians in America who were conservative who said these things are dangerous and America is losing its faith and it's becoming too secular. And so you see the rise of some very, again, politically powerful organizations like the Moral Majority that was established by the Reverend Jerry Falwell in 1979. You can see a cover of a newsletter sent out by the Moral Majority. Again, this organization set up here to as a lobby group, basically, to support conservative causes. A rather alarming front cover, I think we could say. Another of these organizations would be Focus on the Family, set up by a man named James Dobson in 1977. And in the 1980s, guys, we see what you can call, I guess, the golden age of televangelists. Now, if you're not sure what a televangelist is, it is a person who uses the medium of TV to spread their religious beliefs, and often ask for donations. In fact, that seems to be a key component of many of these programs you would watch on TV, is asking for money. There's also, some scandals built into some of these televangelists. For example, there was a well-known one of these, Jimmy Swaggart, who got himself involved in a sex scandal and a fall from grace, rather rapid fall from grace. There was also a fear among many conservatives in the 1980s that America had strayed way too far from its traditional core family values, that divorce rates were too high, there were too many single-family homes, there was just a breakdown in the family, and this was causing greater problems. They would say this is causing greater crime. This is causing Americans to live sinful lives, and so we needed a return to family value. All right, guys, let's now look at the election of 1988. Ronald Reagan obviously can't run for re-election because he's served his first 2 terms, and who would replace him was the big question, and that someone that's going to carry, in theory, conservative Republican values into the 1990s is Reagan's vice president of 8 years, George H.W. Bush. So he's the guy who had been, again, Ronald Reagan's vice president, but had also been in the CIA. He had been a businessman. He had been a World War II fighter pilot and hero. So an all-around attractive candidate, I guess we'll say. And he's riding high on the wave of the strong economy left behind by Ronald Reagan and Reagan's popularity. And so this is almost kind of like a Martin Van Buren riding Andrew Jackson's wave into office for himself. His opponent in 1980 is Michael Dukakis. Now, the Democrats were really, really divided in who they wanted to run. There was talk of perhaps Teddy Kennedy, the younger brother of JFK, running, but he's not going to because of his own scandals. And in the end, the Democrats almost reluctantly choose the liberal governor, Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts. Michael Dukakis turned out to be, frankly, a very weak candidate. Not only is he going up the tidal wave of Reagan's popularity and then thus Bush's popularity, he also just kind of came across as an oddball. For example, the top left picture, what this is about is Michael Dukakis is going up against a war hero, and he's critical of the Reagan-Bush strong foreign policy against the Soviet Union. But Dukakis himself has no military service, and so this was obviously a bit of a weakness, that maybe he's not the guy who can lead the American military. And so to try to, I guess, alleviate some of those concerns, they had this, what turns out to be ridiculous photo op of him riding around in a tank, and it was supposed to make him look powerful. It made him look ridiculous. There was also a very powerful campaign ad known as the Willie Horton ad. And Willie Horton was a guy who had been let out of jail in Massachusetts. They had this furlough policy in Massachusetts. And remember, Dukakis is the governor of Massachusetts. And this would allow prisoners out, like, not permanently, but they could basically be out of jail for a certain amount of time, almost like a vacation from jail. And on one of these furloughs, Willie Horton murdered somebody. And so this is great stuff to use against Michael Dukakis if you are George H.W. Bush. In the end, as you can tell, George Bush wins pretty strongly. Now, it's not quite the beatdown that Reagan had of Mondale, but it's still landslide territory, honestly. All right. Now, one last thing, guys, before we finish up this topic. I do want to very quickly mention a guy you've never heard of, Dan Quayle. So Dan Quayle was from Indiana. He was the vice president of George H.W. Bush. And he was a guy that the press loved to pick on and make fun of and, frankly, hate. And he was depicted as this young, not very bright, not with it guy who was just not ready to assume office if George Bush were to, say, die in office or something like that. And the one thing everybody remembers about Vice President Quayle was a moment that comes at a school where he was visiting and he was helping do a little spelling bee, and the kid spells potato. And Dan Quayle, well, he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry, young man, you misspelled it." And the kid's looking at it like, "Are you sure?" And the reason that he thought he was misspelled is that Quayle believed that potato had an E at the end of it. And so, it just leads to that further, like, are you kidding me? This is our vice president. He can't spell the word potato. All right. So, yeah, there's the corrected version. All right, so that's it, guys. The causes and effects of the resurgence of conservatism in the 1980s. Obviously, Ronald Reagan is the key component in this. Don't be surprised to see at least one Reagan question somewhere on the AP test.